Dobré odpoledne, dámy a pánové, pěkný den. Srdečně vás vítám v Senátu. Za okamžik slavnostně zahájíme konferenci Demokratická revoluce 1989, 30 let poté. Je to mezinárodní konference, kterou pořádá předseda Senátu Parlamentu České republiky Jaroslav Kubera ve spolupráci s Ústavem pro soudobé dějiny Akademie věd České republiky a s Ústavem pro studium totalitních režimů. Akcí, kterými se připomínají listopadové události, je všude kolem nás mnoho, ale tato konference je mimořádná rozsahem a také důsledně odborným zaměřením. Ještě než ji zahájíme, dovolte upozornění, že akce je živě vysílána na webových stránkách Senátu a také mediálně sledována, což je samozřejmě dobře, ovšem z hlediska ochrany osobních údajů s tím prosím počítejte. Konferenci slavnostně zahájí v první řadě hostitel, předseda Senátu, pan Jaroslav Kubera.
Dobrý den, vážená paní předsedkyně, vážení páni ředitelé, senátorky a senátoři, milí hosté. Je osudem našich dějin, že i události docela nedávných, že jsou často interpretovány mnoha často protichůdnými způsoby. Mám dojem, že zvláště my Češi umíme vlastní dějiny pokroutit, rádi podléháme například literárním mýtům, jindy se nezaujatého výkladu vlastní minulosti bojíme. Nelze nevzít v úvahu, že dějiny nejsou jen dějinami národů, ale také prožitkem každého jednotlivého člověka. A často bývají osobní zážitky velmi různorodé, což má ovšem vliv na to, jak každý z nás běh času hodnotí. A tak se sami na sebe občas díváme falešně a zkresleně. A to nás samozřejmě může vést ke špatným rozhodnutím, k mylným očekáváním a zklamáním. Kdo zapomněl nebo si nepřipouští, že se o kamna spálil, spálí se o ně znovu. Jsem proto rád, že spolu s Akademií věd a dalšími odbornými pracovišti pořádá Senát tuto odbornou konferenci. Cílem konference je zhodnotit uplynulých 30 demokratických let a také samozřejmě zhodnotit zrod toho všeho sametovou revoluci. Vnímám jako nesmírně důležité, abychom se uměli správně, bez ideových, osobních, politických a dalších omezení, podívat na to, co rok 1989 přinesl a co přineslo následujících 30 let. Sám jsem na vaše závěry a výzkumy zvědav. Doufám, že akademická půda nebude znamenat ideologický boj o pravdu a že pravda bude nalézána kriticky, objektivně a spravedlivě. Jedině tak nepřibude do našich vlastních dějin další mýtus. Dovolte, abych poděkoval Akademii věd, Ústavu pro soudobé dějiny a Ústavu pro studium totalitních režimů, že se tohoto těžkého úkolu ujali. Výročí sametové revoluce si budeme připomínat různě. Jsem rád, že Senát se kromě dalších akcí rozhodl i pro tuto odbornou konferenci. Děkuji vám za pozornost.
Děkuji panu předsedovi Kuberovi. Jako druhá dostane slovo dáma, předsedkyně Akademie věd České republiky, profesorka Eva Zažímalová.
Vážený pane předsedo Senátu Parlamentu České republiky, vážení pánové ředitelé, vážené dámy, vážení pánové, je to pro mě čest a radost, že můžu být jedním z předřečníků konference, která bude reflektovat to, co nám, řekněme, vzkázal rok 89. A já si dovolím začít trošičku osobní vzpomínkou na dobu ještě dřívější, na rok 68. Mně v té době bylo 13 roků a ještě doteďka si velmi přesně pamatuji tu zoufalou beznaděj, kterou jsme prožívali po okupaci vojsky Varšavské smlouvy. A pak přišla normalizace, já jsem se vdala, měla jsem 2 děti a ještě než jsem ty děti měla, tak jsem si říkala, jestli vůbec do takového režimu je rozumné děti přivádět. A pak nějak ta biologická danost převážila a zkrátka měla jsem to štěstí, že se ty 2 děti narodily a končila jsem 2. mateřskou dovolenou na podzim roku 89. A když jsem se vrátila na ústav, kde jsem tehdy pracovala, tak musím říct, že jsem si všimla okamžitě po té mateřské dovolené té obrovské změny v atmosféře. Bylo to v říjnu roku 89. Lidi se přestávali bát a řekla bych, že v té době bylo cítit, že je ve vzduchu změna. A pak tedy přišla ta změna. My jsme ze začátku se na to dívali s údivem, jestli se to opravdu může stát, a pak s nadšením, že se to stalo. A jsem strašně ráda, že se to stalo přes všechny ty problémy. A myslím si, že i to, že teďka tady můžeme pořádat tuto konferenci, je odrazem toho, že se to stalo. A myslím si, že je to něco, co bychom si měli velmi dobře zapamatovat. Měli bychom si velmi dobře zapamatovat vlastně tu trajektorii toho vývoje, řekněme už z těch dřívějších dob, vlastně de facto celou historii Československá a posléze České republiky. A měli bychom si to velmi dobře pamatovat jako memento, že to, že máme teď demokracie, svobodu slova, že to znamená nejenom tu svobodu, ale znamená to také odpovědnost. A ta odpovědnost znamená, že se musíme opravdu velmi pečlivě hlídat, aby nám tu svobodu nikdo nevzal. Já si myslím, že tohle je to nejdůležitější poselství. Nechci předbíhat, protože nejsem historik, jsem biochemik, ale myslím si, že pro člověka, který alespoň trošku uvažuje, to, že nemá zapomenout a že si z historie má vzít poučení, je to nejdůležitější. Děkuji za pozornost.
Děkuji paní profesorce Zažímalové. Za Ústav pro soudobé dějiny Akademie věd promluví jeho ředitel, profesor Miroslav Vaněk.
Dobré odpoledne, vážený pane předsedo Senátu Parlamentu České republiky, vážená předsedkyně Akademie věd, vážený pane řediteli, vážení hosté. Jsem moc rád, že jste přišli dneska na tuhletu významnou chvíli. Myslím si, že 30 let je velké dlouhé období, kdy můžeme vlastně reflektovat skutečnost, kterou si ještě mnozí pamatujeme a která se neustále vyvíjí, protože si myslím, že listopad 1989 není jenom historickou záležitostí, ale je to živý svátek, který se neustále proměňuje v té paměti, která v nás obklopuje, a myslím si, že je dobré vlastně čas od času a vlastně 30 let poté vlastně na vědecké úrovni si tady říct, k čemu jsme došli. Nejenom co bylo v roce 89, ale vlastně reflexi toho období. Nechci vlastně o tom tady vůbec přednášet, budou tady jiní. Moc děkuji všem hostům, kteří přijeli ze zahraničí, kteří přišli od nás z Českých luhů a hájů. Strašně rád bych poděkoval všem, kteří připravovali vědeckou náplň této konference, což je za Ústav pro soudobé dějiny Jiří Suk a Tomáš Vilímek, a velmi nám pomáhla Lucie Marková. Ústav pro studium totalitních režimů jistě pochválí pan ředitel Zdeněk Hazdra. Takže já vlastně vám jenom přeju, aby byla tahleta konference úspěšná do té míry, co přinese nového. Budeme ji hodnotit poté a chci vás ještě jednou přivítat, a abyste si tyhle dny vlastně užili a všichni dohromady, abychom zapřemýšleli o tom odkazu 17. listopadu. Děkuji vám.
Děkuji panu řediteli Vaňkovi a ještě za Ústav pro studium totalitních režimů pronese slavnostní slovo ředitel ústavu doktor Zdeněk Hazdra.
Vážený pane předsedo Senátu, vážená paní předsedkyně Akademie věd, vážený pane řediteli, vzácní hosté, dámy a pánové. Čeká nás několikadenní, respektive třídenní konferenční rokování o událostech, od kterých nás dělí 30 let. Ale nejenom od nich. Řada příspěvků se chce věnovat reflektování cesty, kterou jsme od listopadu 89 urazili. Když říkám my, mám na mysli jak českou společnost, tak i další země někdejšího východního bloku. Pokládám tuhle reflexi za velmi důležitou. Obecně sice vždycky platí, že z minulosti se máme poučit, ale v tomto případě, kdy se jedná o události nedávné a pořád ještě živé v každém z nás, to může být poučení vůbec nejcennější. Říká se občas, že úkolem historika je rozpoznávat výzvy. Výzvy, které před lidmi stály v určité době. Jakou výzvu pro nás tedy znamenal listopad 1989? Rozpoznali jsme ji vůbec a jak jsme ji uchopili? Kolem listopadu slýcháme spoustu frází. Především, že máme svobodu a že už můžeme, co jsme dřív nemohli. Je tohle opravdu celý odkaz listopadu 89? Když se to formuluje takhle na povrchu, možná se tím maskuje skutečnost, že se nepříliš poctivě přemýšlí nad tím, jaká očekávání měli lidé od 17. listopadu a jak to s těmi očekáváními dopadlo a proč. Mnohé se změnilo, to je jasné, ale co z těch změn je opravdu podstatné? Jak mnoho jsme se vzdálili od marazmu normalizačních časů? Nevracíme se tam zase? Není naše společnost opět nějak podivně rozdělená? A proč je všude kolem tolik frustrace? Někdo by možná řekl, že tohle jsou otázky spíš pro psychologa nebo sociologa, než pro historika. Ale myslím, že bez poctivé historické reflexe na ně nikdo nenajde pravdivou odpověď. Ano, máme za sebou 30 svobodných let, což je v naší novodobé historii rarita. 30 svobodných let tu opravdu ještě nebylo. Komunisté zatím měli dopřáno více času, ale pozor, už se to pomalu vyrovnává. A právě na nás tím pádem nejvíc záleží, jaký obsah a jaký étos budou mít pojmy svoboda a demokracie. Bohužel občas mám pocit, že právě tento fakt nám nedochází. Jako bychom si málo uvědomovali, že sametovou revolucí nic neskončilo a že právě na nás leží obrovská míra odpovědnosti za to, jak odkaz roku 89 dopadne, jak ho budeme dále rozvíjet. Příběh, který započal, může vstoupit do dějin jako velký a hodný následování, anebo také jako promarněný pokus, což by samozřejmě byla škoda. O tom se možná právě rozhoduje. Ne všechno samozřejmě můžeme na této konferenci řešit, ale aby se naše společnost mohla rozhodovat odpovědně, k tomu je důležité pokusit se o kritické ohlédnutí jak za listopadovým děním, tak za následujícími 3 dekádami. Ať se jedná o politické a společenské změny, ekonomickou transformaci a proměny centrálně plánovaného hospodářství v tržní ekonomiku, nebo změny v sociální oblasti, včetně vytváření nových nerovností a nových hrozeb. V neposlední řadě je důležité si položit otázku, jak se stavíme k vlastní minulosti, konkrétně k té, které se říká totalitní. Jak jsme se s ní vyrovnali? Nezůstal z toho nakonec jenom spor mezi velmi úzkou skupinkou politiků a intelektuálů, zatímco nikoho dalšího to až tak moc nezajímá? Závažných otázek se nabízí celá řada a nepochybně jim bude během této konference věnována pozornost. Těší mě, že je již nepsanou a též nesamozřejmou tradicí, že Ústav pro studium totalitních režimů pořádá stěžejní konference k významným momentům našich nedávných dějin společně s některým z historických ústavů Akademie věd České republiky, v tomto případě s Ústavem pro soudobé dějiny. A já tímto děkuji právě zejména panu řediteli Miroslavu Vaňkovi. A když mě vyzval, abych samozřejmě nezapomněl na své kolegy z Ústavu pro studium totalitních režimů, tak v této souvislosti pochopitelně nemohu opomenout svého kolegu Ondřeje Matějku, s kterým jsme ten program za ústav dávali dohromady společně právě v kooperaci s kolegy z Ústavu pro soudobé dějiny a to organizační zajištění, kromě báječných kolegyň zde ze Senátu, u nás mají na starost kolegové Jan Vondryska, kolegyně Anička Macourková a celá řada dalších, ale na jejich bedrech ta organizace této akce opravdu stojí. No a samozřejmě v neposlední řadě nesmím zapomenout poděkovat panu předsedovi Senátu Jaroslavu Kuberovi, že tuto akci zaštítil a podpořil. A jsem velmi rád, že je tady mezi námi. A nám všem přeju, aby ty následující dny a že toho pátečního večera byly inspirativní a přinášely nám všem nové poznatky a všechny nás obohatili. Děkuji vám za pozornost.
Děkuji panu řediteli Hazdrovi. Dámy a pánové, mezinárodní konferenci Demokratická revoluce 1989, 30 let poté, můžeme v této chvíli pokládat za zahájenou. Ať se vydaří. A předám vám slovo moderátorovi prvního odborného bloku Michalu Kopečkovi.
Děkuji za slovo, děkuji i za všechny projevy. Pro mě je velkou ctí, že mohu předsedat prvnímu panelu naší velké mezinárodní konference, panelu, který se nazývá Od krize komunistické diktatury ke krizi liberální demokracie. Ten název je možná trošičku zavádějící v tom smyslu, že tím hlavním cílem a tématem toho našeho panelu bude snaha podívat se z velice rozdílných perspektiv podle složení hostů na to, jakou roli hraje rok 1989 a demokratická revoluce jako specifické místo historické paměti v českých, středoevropských, evropských dějinách. Já bych zahájil ten panel v češtině, představím nejdřív v češtině hosty, ale protože to je diskuzní panel, tak přejdeme potom do angličtiny, aby si hosté navzájem rozuměli, aby nebyli odkázáni na simultánní tlumočení. Takže já jsem velice rád, že mohu mezi hosty přivítat význačné osobnosti současné sociální vědy a historiografie a politologie, řekl bych z celé Evropy. První je Agnes Gádi, socioložka, která se zabývá politickými, sedící hned tady po mé levici, socioložka zabývající se politickými a sociálními hnutími ve střední a východní Evropě z perspektivy dlouhodobé ekonomické a geopolitické integrace, působí na univerzitě ve švédském Göteborgu a je členkou budapeštské pracovní skupiny pro takzvanou veřejnou sociologii Hejzet. Je autorskou z poslední doby, autorkou knihy, která vyšla v maďarštině. V češtině její název zní Politika krize, nová hnutí ve střední a východní Evropě v globální perspektivě, která vyšla právě tento rok. Hned vedle ní sedí další host, účastnice našeho panelu Dagmar Kusá, která působí na Bratislavské mezinárodní škole liberálních studií, kde vyučuje mezinárodní konflikt a spolupráci, narrativy konfliktu, traumatu, smíření a komparativní politiku. Zaměřuje se geograficky zejména na srovnání všech těch procesů paměti, vyrovnávání se s minulostí a zakládání demokratického společenství jednak ve střední Evropě, ale jednak také v Jihoafrické republice. V poslední době k tomu právě editovala monografii Identities in Flux, Globalization, Trauma and Reconciliation. Dále publikovala také studie The Born Frees as Assertive Citizens, Students, Protests and Democratic Prospects in South Africa, takže vidíte tady ten důraz na Jižní Afriku a ve slovenštině pak minulý rok Režim paměti, spravodlivá společnost. Vedle Dagmar Kuse sedí Pavel Barša, politolog, výzkumný pracovník Ústavu mezinárodních vztahů a zároveň také profesor na Ústavu politologie na Filozofické fakultě Univerzity Karlovy. Pavel Barša se zabývá mezinárodní politikou, proměnami mezinárodního světového řádu, nacionalismem a také historickou pamětí. Řada jeho vydal v posledních letech řadu knih, mnohé z nich jistě znáte, Cesty k emancipaci, Orientálcova spoura nebo Paměť a genocida. A last but not least, nejdále ode mě sedí James Mark, který je profesorem historie na univerzitě v Exeteru, jihoanglickém. Mezi jeho badatelské zájmy patří také politika paměti, sociální, kulturní, historie státního socialismu ve střední a východní Evropě a snaží se ve svých pracech nahlížet ty změny, ke kterým docházelo v 80. a 90. letech v širším globálním rámci. Je autorem velice citované a slavné knihy The Unfinished Revolution, Making Sense of the Communist Past in Central and Eastern Europe, která vyšla v roce 2010. dále spoluautorem knih Europe 1968, Voices of Revolt a knihy, která ještě nevyšla, ale vychází v těchto dnech, která se jmenuje 1989, A Global History of Eastern Europe, a která má právě vyjít ke 30. výročí revolucí ve střední a východní Evropě a kterou všichni nedočkavě očekáváme. So now let me switch to English so that we can communicate with our panelists without a language barrier. Now, our panel is introducing a conference that should be reflecting on 30 years of research and debates, not only among researchers but also in public, on the nature of democratic revolutions of 1989. So I guess what we learn in the next 2.5 days is a lot about what has been done new, what new paths were opened in terms of our understanding of the international context, of the domestic, economic, social and political preconditions in the individual societies in Central and Eastern Europe at the time of the crumbling down of the communist regimes. What are the new perspectives? What are the new discussion debates in social and historical research of nowadays? This panel today is somewhat different. It has a different character. It attempts to look at 1989 as the center of our political and civic identity, as a milestone of the some of the political philosophers are calling narratives of democracy. So also the way of how we actually understand ourselves as Democrat and what role the 1989 actually plays in this narrative. For quite a time already, the democratic character of the 1989 revolution, as well as the reading of 1989 as the major constitutional moments of the newborn democratic communities after 1989, has been put into doubt, and it is not only a question of the populist movements in nowadays, not only Central but also Central and Eastern Europe, but also Western Europe. So people are asking, was it mainly 1989, was it mainly democratic revolution, or was it more liberal revolution? Was it maybe neoliberal revolution, or was it actually capitalist revolution? How should we understand 1989? Was it revolution at all? So this is a topic, these are themes that we would like to address in our panel today, and I have prepared 4 major questions that I offered to the panelists. It's actually then up to them how they pick on it and what they are going to elaborate. Everyone gets 10 minutes, then we can still have some kind of discussion among ourselves, and then afterwards I will open the discussion also to the audience. So what are these 4 basic questions? I go through them now, and then I open the panel to the participants. First question is more personal. When you look at your own personal, civic or political identity, what role did 1989 play in your sort of political growing or political education, let's say 10 or 15 years ago? And what does it mean for you today? Did something change in the meantime, 15 years ago and nowadays? And if something changed, why and what changed? The second question, what does 1989 stand actually for, in your opinion, in the long-term historical development of modern democracy in Europe and the world? What role does 1989 play in our understanding of democracy in the whole European development? Third question, our views on late communist dictatorship, on 1989 revolutions and on the transition era are changing rapidly. Now my question is, what is actually the main driving force of this change? Is it the historical and social scientific research that is bringing new perspectives, that is bringing new methodological standpoints, and that is also bringing new interpretation? Or is it more, let's say, social and political thing? Is it what the Hegelians would call the zeitgeist? Is it the rashly changing political environment and configurations in nowadays world? It means, is it the uncertainties of global capitalism? Is it the rise of populist movements? Is it the rise of new climate politics that is completely changing our view on 1989? So what is actually the main driving force behind our new questions that we are actually posing to the past? And last question, the fourth one, 1989 served for quite a long time actually as an export item. We made peaceful, velvet, democratic revolution, and we had the feeling that we can, in a way, tell to the world how to do it in other parts of the world. It was referred to in the colorful revolutions in Eastern Europe in 2000s. It was referred to during the Arab Spring. Afterwards, it was referred to, for instance, last year in the Armenian democratic and velvet revolution, as it called itself like that, just 2018. It had the picture of 1989 and of velvet or peaceful or democratic revolution had a certain mobilization and social mobilization potential. Many, however, think today that actually this model failed and that this model actually never worked. Now, my question is, should we understand this annus mirabilis, 1989, indeed as a unique, one-in-a-lifetime event, something that cannot be repeated and all other events will be different? Or does it still set up some kind of example that the democratic revolutions and democratic movement can follow up? Can the democratic movement of nowadays and democratic emancipation movement can learn from 1989 and can use something of its instrumentarium for the future? So these are the four major questions. I'm not pushing any one of the panelists into all four of them. Now I would like to give the floor to James Mark, who promised to have some pictures, so I think this is a good way to start. So James, go ahead. Okay, I'm sorry. We will have a discussion. We will have a discussion afterwards. Absolutely. When he comes, he can speak too. Thank you very much, James. Go ahead.
Good evening. Thank you very much for the kind introduction, and thank you very much to all the organizers for giving us the opportunity to reflect on the meanings of 1989, 30 years after. I thought about starting off with a reflection on 1989 as an export item. And from where I come from in Great Britain, but also in Western Europe more broadly and across the Anglo-American world, the image that dominates from 1989 still and gets endlessly replayed on anniversaries is from Germany, and in particular from Berlin. These images of the Berlin Wall being surmounted and then destroyed encapsulate many of the Western liberal assumptions about the meanings of 1989, including, I would say, this David Hasselhoff type character on our right, taken from Berlin this year. The collapse of state socialism was inevitable in the region that could no longer survive isolation behind walls in the now increasingly globalized and interconnected world. That change was led by cheerful crowds yearning to escape their isolation and for Western freedoms. And this whole spectacle, on repeat anniversary after anniversary, becomes this visual shorthand for a much wider apparatus of Western liberalism, showing a region moving from passivity to mobility, from the plan to the market, from the old to the modern, from the east in a westerly direction. And certainly if I look at the British press, as I said, it's Berlin and very little else. Now, as a historian, I would question some of the myths that are made real for people through these types of images, how they sideline the work of many important actors in these revolutions, including maybe most controversially reform communists, how they show the East wanting to be like the West and not asking how the West was reshaped by these changes too, a unidirectional imagery of them over there wanting to be like us. and how, in the context of the unification of Europe over the following decades, they in some ways deglobalize, provincialize the collapse into a pan-German or at most a European story. Nevertheless, this particular reading, whatever its limitations, had an important role after '89. It was absolutely fundamental to the new image or self-understanding of the West after the Cold War and had very profound consequences. It naturalized the convergence, of liberal democracy and the market in a globalizing world that would be led by the West. This example from Eastern Europe was paraded to the world through many political and economic institutions, including to Africa in the 1990s, where this convergence of the market and good governance, exemplified by the revolutions in Eastern Europe, was seen as a natural new order. Again, it becomes replayed in the Iraq War in 2003 and then during the Arab Spring in 2011. This is a naturalized order that can be exported to other parts of the world. And of course, many Central and Eastern Europeans are very happy to align themselves to these readings of 1989. Balcerowicz, the architect of Polish shock therapy, goes to Iraq in 2003 to help design privatization after the invasion. Václav Havel's writings on dictatorship become translated into Arabic during the Arab Spring from 2011. So there are all sorts of ways in which 1989 has become a global memory, a part of the global identity of the West. But recently we've seen a crisis in how this story of liberalization and democratization is narrated. And of course, it wasn't only Eastern Europe that went through these processes. This was part of what some people call the third wave of democratization that swept Southern Europe, Latin America, Eastern Europe, and then, to a certain degree, into Africa. And we've seen it in Southern Europe, and we saw it this week in Chile with protests. We've seen it from the left in Greece and from Spain critiquing their own transitions in the late 70s, or in Chile's case in the late 1980s, as the foundation of problems stored up, of the inability to write a proper democratic constitution or to break with older economic linkages, which caused corruption in the contemporary. Second, we see far-right authoritarians, particularly Duterte in the Philippines and Bolsonaro in Brazil, rejecting the stories of their own liberal transitions and the human rights cultures that they brought. Third, we see the West also giving up on this export of 1989 as the embodiment of liberalization and marketization, particularly after the failures of the Arab Spring. And here in Central Eastern Europe, we have their own particular crisis, which I would probably argue came much earlier. Indeed, if we look as early as the mid-1990s, we see conservative parties in particular presenting 1989 as an unfinished revolution or as a betrayal, or one that didn't really cut links with the communist past sufficiently. And indeed, outside Berlin and Prague in the 2000s, you were very unlikely to see much commemoration of 1989. And here I can say Prague is a real exception in the region here. And as populists came to power in Hungary, Poland, and elsewhere in the 2010s, they wanted to clear away the liberal 1989. They were creating their own new revolution that was a proper break from a liberal leftist past, as they saw it. Viktor Orban in Hungary called for a revolution at the polling booths to achieve what had not been achieved in 1989. They came to see themselves as rejecting a form of convergence known as transition, the idea of an inevitable convergence on a liberal West, and rather looked for their own economic and cultural forms. Some came to argue that they were the true Europe, not the West. They were conservative, anti-multicultural, anti-Islamic, and anti-gender politics. There's a very conservative, white, racialized image of the continent. And they often looked to relationships increasingly well beyond the West. Russia revived its Cold War linkages with Africa. And of course, most importantly now, the region is connected much more closely to China through its 16+1 policy. So the need to present symbols of liberal convergence on the West, of which 1989 is a prime symbol, went into abeyance in the 2010s. But I would argue that in the last few years, things have begun to change. Firstly, 1989 has been revived as a symbol of civic resistance. This isn't... Could you move it forward one slide? No? So 1989 has been revived as a symbol of civic resistance from organizations fighting against corruption or illiberalism. And they draw on many of the symbols from 1989 itself. It's also gone global. We can see this year, 2019, protesters in Hong Kong against a Chinese extradition law, which has become a much broader protest against Chinese influence in Hong Kong, have drawn upon the repertoires. Okay, so this is an image from Bucharest last year. Here, most literally drawing on 89 in protest against corruption. This is from 2019 in Hong Kong. And you see, on one hand, you find on the right, you find the use of Lenin walls. These were an idea taken from 1980s Czechoslovakia of demonstrating support for dissidents by leaving images on public walls. This was then revived earlier this year as post-it notes placed in their thousands in metro stations in Hong Kong. Then you see on the right, an imitation in August of this year on exactly the 30th anniversary of the Baltic chain of millions of Baltic citizens linking their arms to denote their struggle for independence from Moscow. Exactly 30 years later, here they are creating their own Baltic chain, now as a Hong Kong chain, symbolizing their distance from Beijing. But also I've noticed this year a desire for I would say, right-wing populists to suddenly start instrumentalizing the memory of 1989. For 20 years, they talked about it as a betrayal, as something that was not a proper revolution. And then suddenly this year, we found them turning to its memory. I don't know whether we can see the film as I talk. No. This was a film created for a rock festival on Heroes Square this summer in Budapest. And here we see 1989 represented as the foundation moment for a conservative, cultural counter-revolution of the present. A Catholic, nationalist, pro-natalist idea about 1989, and 1989 as embodying a series of anti-totalitarian struggles that can now be used to defend a Christian Europe. We also see this being mainstreamed in the West as well. If I can I move the slide one more? So 2 weeks ago, we had Maria Schmidt, the ideologue of Viktor Orban's regime, presenting 1989 as part of the broader struggle of the West to protect itself from cultural relativism, cultural Marxism, Islamicization, and gender ideology. And we've seen this also slipping into the works of American libertarians and the Trump right, giving very similar types of accounts of what the meaning of 1989 should now be. So the last point I want to make, I should stop, right? Yeah, the last point, just one last point. So, and I guess this feeds into the historical agenda of the conference. Is this current moment a rejection of the liberal values of 1989, or can we also find the origins of the current turn in these years? This was a question and was very important to the book we've just written on 1989 in global perspective. And two ideas that I want to throw out, which we can talk more about at the conference, is one, the idea of a civilizationally bordered Europe was very much the production of the years around 1989, which has now become a central part of many populist agendas. And secondly, the illiberal 1989. And one point I'd like to explore is how within the liberal democratic revolution, there were many authoritarian and illiberal currents which have not really been excavated enough. Anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, James. Thank you for showing actually the what many directions this imaginary of 1989 goes. And now I think Pavel Barsha will continue.
Yeah. It reminds me also that Pegida in Dresden is using also they are organizing their Mondays, I think, meeting also with the reference to the unfinished revolution of '89. So I agree that the use of '89 is quite widespread and it stretches from far right to the left liberals. I don't know if the far left is participating in that. I doubt so. And maybe what I will say now will explain a little bit why the far left is not really. Probably. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe somebody will tell me that some far left people also use 89 reference, but I don't think so. It's and I will try to explain why. Actually, in my short talk, I will ask the question what actually 89 meant or means in terms of modern emancipatory movements. What kind of emancipation did the people 30 years ago thrived for? And what 89 symbolizes in this, in those terms? And also, what's the alternative? What's an alternative kind of emancipation which can be put against 89 model? Let me begin with a memory, with a personal memory. In the spring of '89, we, with a couple of friends, we got a small, very primitive machine which was able to produce leaflets. And we were thinking what would be the first leaflet we will produce with that machine. And one friend of mine realized that there is approaching this rounded anniversary of the French Revolution in July 200, and she said, why not to reproduce, basically to print the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. And we immediately all agreed that that's the right text, for the first leaflet. I'm sorry to say that the action was not carried out because several weeks after that, there was a brutal massacre at Tiananmen Square, which deprived us of civic courage to carry out the plan. But I mentioned it because I think the immediate spontaneous agreement about the importance of that declaration from '89, is telling something about the spirit of the Velvet Revolution in this country. Because what we wanted and what we were after in that moment were actually what Marxists would call derogatorily bourgeois freedoms. Bourgeois freedoms. Of course, the French Revolution, in its later phases, also provided a model for another type of emancipation, quite opposite to what for us symbolized the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, namely in 1792-93, where the radical wing of the Jacobins came to power. They came to power with the help of the sans-culottes, who were able to mobilize street. And they began to use quite violent methods, both on the streets of Paris and the Jacobins when they took power in the States. And that was actually the driving force for that kind of mobilization was not to affirm civic rights face to face the tyrannical state, but rather to use the state to sort out the social question, to use the state and also with the, possibly with the violent means, namely the question of inequality between the rich and the poor. The state was supposed to redistribute to the wealth from the rich to the poor, in the name of the poor, in the name of the people. In that particular context, it meant inferior classes of the society, those working people who were exploited by the rich. And that was the template for what actually revolution meant for the following 150 years. Namely, the revolution which didn't refer to individualistic values, to the rights of citizens, to the rights of man, but rather to a collective entity, be it exploited class, be it colonized nation, be it the people ruled over by an alienated elite. So an alternative kind of emancipation was actually, as I said, collectivistic and pro-state. Actually, in the first case, we can call the first model of revolution civic revolution. Here, the state would be something which we should be protected against. And the second kind of revolution we can call political revolutions proper, because they had a strong program of societal transformation, and they wanted to take power in the state and use the state to carry out their program. Now, if we go to the 20th century, to the short 20th century, as Eric Hobsbawm called it, it was actually characterized by an offensive of those revolutionary movements. Beginning, of course, with the Bolshevik Revolution, which stylized itself as the finish, as the completion of the Jacobin Revolution. But the Bolshevik idea and reality of a one-party state was quite influential, even among those revolutionary movements which were not really Marxist, especially in the non-European colonized world. So you had not only socialist movements which were trying to repeat the Bolshevik success, but also decolonizing nationalist movement or national liberationist movements, which also many of them, after they made their revolutions, established one-party state and used the state to transform radically society. This, of course, as you certainly know, Eric Hobsbawm says that this 20th century, characterized by the offensive of this kind of movements, ended up in 1989. I would say that it ended ideologically much earlier. I would say that the swan song of that century was 1968. The last upsurge of the movements which cherish this idea of collective self-determination. And some of them were already anarchistic and quite critical of the state, but many of them still were using this idea that the strong state is important to realize the revolutionary and emancipatory goals. Now, that idea, that utopia, revolutionary utopia, began to fade away in the 70s. Historians now use this term long 70s to catch exactly this deep transformation especially in the West, but also in other parts of the world, when this old revolutionary collectivistic utopia, which was taking the state as an instrument of emancipation, was progressively replaced by another utopia. Some call it last utopia, minimal utopia, which drew actually on the first kind of emancipatory, the first emancipatory model with which I began. Namely, one of the embodiments of this new spirit was a human rights movement, and especially globalist human rights movement, which didn't limit itself to this country or that country, but which understood itself as a global, exactly because the state was something against which we were to protect ourselves as individuals. So that's described best by Samuel Moyn, but there were not only human rights movements, but also other kinds of movements which we could call, in some contexts we call them new social movements, unlike those old social movements which are like national liberationist movement or socialist movement, which had those revolutionary ambitions, and they were, as I said, statist. Those new social movements were actually, most of them were having agenda which were opposite to that, which was basically to protect autonomous individuals or communities against the strong state. They were based on the idea that the biggest danger we face is actually the state. So the state changed completely significance. For the first movements, it was the state which was supposed to emancipate the people, exploited classes, or colonized nations. In the second case, the state was something to be feared, not something to be hoped for that it will help us. And so that was the spirit, I think, which then was encapsulated in the Velvet Revolution. This kind of minimal utopia, this kind of revolution, civic revolution, which actually refers to liberal values, specifically liberal values, like procedural impartiality of the state, the rule of law, checks and balances, plurality of media, all those things and arrangements which allow civil society to thrive, and which allow civil society to build itself as an alternative space vis-à-vis the state, the state agencies. I have 3 minutes left. So if we now make a jump to the present, I think what's clear is that I would say that the Arab Spring 2011-2013 was the swan song of this kind of the era of the civic revolutions. I agree completely with James that many of those revolutions are still going on, but the context has completely changed, and I think, and because I have to finish, I will probably condensate it into 1, 2, 3 sentences. The context. What prevailed for my generation, at least, I was in my 20s, late 20s in '89, was really that we feared the state. We feared the state most. So our idea of emancipation was to be emancipated from the state, right? Like today, I think the prevalent mood changed radically. People fear powerlessness vis-à-vis non-state forces, non-state anonymous forces of global capitalism, of climatic change, all those things which we cannot really control. So many of those populist movements are actually drawing on the second revolutionary tradition, because they are saying, yes, we can control them. We can bring the state back. The state can protect you from global capitalism. The state can protect you from from other ills from culture insecurity, for instance, in the case of the Islamophobes. So I think that's what we are living now, that the spirit of '89, which was civic spirit, liberal spirit, is now replaced by a sort of swing of the pendulum to the other kind of emancipation, which is pro-state rather than against state. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Pavel, and I think that you prepared the ground for the two next speakers. We decided that we go just along the row, so we now proceed with Dagmar Kusa.
Thank you very much. I'm already tempted to also react, but I think we'll have time to come back.
Well, it depends how long you speak, so you might have some time, yes, afterwards.
I have some time. Maybe I will just react at first for 2 minutes, and then I will go back to what I prepared. I was intrigued by all of the questions, and when James was speaking about the revolution as an export model, I was thinking about that a lot, and especially as a political scientist. I mean, naturally, 1989 was extremely influential, extremely inspiring, both here. It continues to be, at least for some people. We know that it's not equally inspirational anymore for all of the people. But there's a difference between inspiration, kind of an emotional appeal towards mobilization of the masses, etc., and a model that should be replicated somewhere. So from this latter perspective, if we look at the revolution as a model, especially the 1989 revolutions in Central Europe, which actually had certain characteristics in common. You know, there was the people power on the streets, you had identifiable group of dissidents, at least in the narrative, they emerge as the men of the revolution, you know, in the November Revolution narrative. That's how it is portrayed. You had the negotiations of the power transfers, dissidents with the reformist communists. I mean, the whole of this is the package of this model. So then it becomes more problematic to think about 1989 revolutions as a model for exports, because of course you can look at individual parts of it as tools in a toolkit that could be replicated very much depending on the context of where we want to replicate it in, but perhaps not all of it as a package, and perhaps that's not even possible or maybe even desirable. When we think about, for example, I mean, of course, and none of them alone were quite unique. You know, we've had the principle of nonviolence implemented in other protests before that. It has not originated here. The ideas, I mean, of course, have much older philosophical roots that people were essentially struggling for during 1989, even in Central and Eastern Europe, etc. But together the combination was perhaps unique. Now, if we, of course, nonviolence is probably a commendable principle to be replicated, but if we think about the negotiated power transfer as a model, it quickly becomes tricky, and we see that in variety of contexts, not excluding our own context as well, because if we consider the consequences of negotiated power transfer, we have to count on amnesty or de facto amnesty of the former communist leaders, including those who signed orders for murders or for jail, torture, etc., etc. It may have serious consequences for the nature of justice down the line, a few decades down the line, maybe even. We see that here. We see that, for example, in South Africa, which may be one of the examples where actually the negotiated transfer was at least partially motivated by the 1989 model. And I say partially because context matters, and in African context, the actual fall of the Soviet Union was a much stronger impetus for negotiations than anything else, because, for example, in South Africa, people were ready to fight. Up to 1989, the route towards toppling the apartheid regime was envisioned through a military takeover of the power. not through negotiations. I mean, that was perhaps Mandela's idea towards the late 1980s, but that was already within the context of perestroika and of when it was becoming apparent that the Soviet Union and the bipolar order of the world will be slightly changing. So in both of these contexts, we see how negotiations have serious consequences for justice much later on, even for today, when we speak about corruption in Central European region and in South Africa. That's one area where we are remarkably similar. Unfortunately, when you ask people, they do see a direct link between this impunity during 1989 and shortly after 1989 and present state of corruption and severe problems with the rules of law. In other instances, it was used as a waiting tool, you know, negotiations in Rwanda, which also followed the breakdown of the Cold War order of the world. Essentially there it was used as a tactic to prepare the ground essentially for genocide. And unfortunately the world bought it. So it has other consequences to consider that are not quite only encapsulated in that symbolic package. That's actually not at all what I wanted to speak about. I wanted to speak about, more specifically about Slovakia and the meaning of 1989 for our context, both from personal, academic, and political perspective. I see them as very important because they're not, sometimes they're like, they lead to a schizophrenia. I was thinking about it, and I don't know how much time I have actually left. I think just 5 minutes. Okay, well, anyway, I can try. Through my own struggle with the 1989 message or legacy for all of these three levels. So personally, I have a very different relationship to this event than as an academic and as a citizen of my country. Very different, as if they were radically different people even. So on a personal level, it's probably the most emotional relation. I was there, I was 13, you know, my father was in jail just before that, and it was essentially the first political memories of my life are connected to 1989. We're an identifiable cohort of people. I know my peers within this kind of a generational unit who feel this way, who have this emotional attachment, strong and for life, to 1989. Because, I mean, sociology of generations, if you live through something in your young adolescence, and it's an important political event like this, it shapes your generation or unit of your generation essentially for life. So, you know, that's quite clear. As an academic growing up in Central Europe, you had to, I mean, almost immediately we had an influx of literature from the West. We were all reading, of course, Fukuyama, Huntington, the third wave. That was our Bible, essentially. And willingly so, you know, it's in a way it's natural. We were reading Hayek and Novak and all of these people. So that has shaped us for at least a decade, I think. It came much later, thinking back to maybe 15 years ago when we entered the EU. I mean, that's how the question stood. With the encounters with other literature, especially comparisons to other contexts, thinking about transitions in Latin America, reading dependency theories, for example, thinking about transitions in African context, that was a handful, you know, because coming from this experience with 1999 and comparing the experience of a South African opposition, which was very pro-Marxist and communist and was supported by Soviet Union and Czechoslovak government with money as well as equipment, etc., etc. And yet they were fighting for the same human rights, same freedom, same political determination. It was extremely difficult to reconcile rationally somehow. It seemed almost impossible. But essentially, I think that's where the evolution in academia has been most helpful in these kinds of quests, because thinking about the transnational looks at these evolutions, and especially in this sense, thinking about kind of the moral globalization that was happening in the second half of 20th century, the human rights story, as you mentioned. I think that helps us understand how these kinds of paradoxes are possible when essentially people on extremely different contexts, you know, one militarized, opposition, heavily organized with long tradition, to a handful of dissidents somewhere in Eastern Europe. That was essentially that which can help us explain how these two very different communities could have ended up with a very similar outcome in a way after 1989. And politically, of course, currently, I think the first thing that I started with is relevant for the last thing, for the political identity. Of course, we're living in, our hot topic is corruption and captured state and mafia state, especially in Slovakia. That's, you know, that's our entertainment these days. We follow the court trials, and we essentially discover new links between the state and mafia every day, and between judges and mafia every day. That's where you see the linkages that go back directly before 1989, and how they are specifically relevant today. So you see people that are extremely frustrated. I mean, in recent public opinion poll, it came out that Slovaks actually see the previous regime as slightly more positive as the current regime, and significantly the economic regime, they see it as better as the current economic regime. That is significant. And it's not only the people who subscribe to populism or extreme radical solutions that feel this way. Increasingly, you have the most vulnerable groups that feel completely disenfranchised. I see it, for example, in the communities of LGBT people who are so frustrated and so fed up, not only because of the social economic inequalities, which frustrate everyone, but because of deficit democracy that failed to deliver on those promises in 1989 in terms of those basic principles of human rights and their implementation for all of the communities. Last second, I'm also optimistic. We might feel the present time very bleakly, but there's also, perhaps related to all of the dirt that is being uncovered and how judges are being finally held accountable and first court trials actually happening. So we actually feel more optimistic about the future than our Czech counterparts. So that's one reason for hope. And second, that there is, as one of you has mentioned, there's kind of a comeback to this symbolism. We see it in the young generation, the students that led the corruption protests in all over Slovakia throughout the last year. They were actually carrying the 1989 revolution banners. Some of them have seen them for the first time then, but they suddenly became meaningful. And it's up to that generation to look for those legacies in the past. And this was the first time when this legacy, this particular legacy, became meaningful and became adopted, essentially, by this generation. So, okay, that's it for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I would add that actually this is the same now in this country, where the big movement of the youngest generation, Milion Chvilek pro Democracy, is exactly so picking up on the symbolism of 1989. Last but not least, we have Agnes Kaji to speak. So Agnes, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So on the personal side, I was born in Romania in 1980. In 1989, in December, with the family, we were preparing to move to our grandparents, so that, because in the news we heard that the military is shooting at the people. And my mother was about to give birth to my brother. So the idea was that we would move into our grandparents so that we are at least together when violence would be on the street. And we were looking for medical utensils in case my mother would give birth during that time. in a city that was, of course, completely empty in this extreme form of shortage economy. Okay, so on that basis, I grew up to be that generation which just grew up to see the failure of the promises of transition. And I became part of this generation who didn't shift as a response to the political right, but to the political left, and started to try to understand what was happening in terms of capitalist integration and the processes of unequal accumulation and the power differences that go with it. Now, from this perspective, we came to see '89 as a democratic revolution in terms of the institutionalization of formal democracy. But we also saw it as not democratic in terms of the structural process that came to be mediated by those who came to power in those institutions. Now, in a broader analysis from a political economy perspective, we could say that these structural processes were part of a long wave of structural transformation, and they were already defined by the way socialist economies were embedded in the world economy previously, meaning especially the dependent external integration that these efforts for import substitution industrialization were part of. Most importantly, the need to import developed technology and the pressure to be able to pay for it in hard currency, which later develops into indebtedness. And then this type of crisis of the socialist economies becomes integrated into subsequent waves of crisis management by core economies within the long downturn of the post-45 global cycle, in a way in which this crisis management of core economies manages to outsource crisis effects from core economies to semi-peripheries and peripheries. Cheap loans flowing to Eastern Europe and other parts of the globe too, like Latin America in the 70s, that become extremely expensive in the 80s. Or the waves of privatization, FDI, the wave of financial loans. We can say that this is part of this larger process. We can say that the socially detrimental aspects of the transition, like privatization, the concentration of social wealth in the private hands of a few, technological integration on low levels of global value chains, where the cheapness of Eastern European workforce is used to compensate for the profitability crisis of industries in the West. Financial indebtedness, unemployment, cuts of social security, increasing flexibilization of labor. We can say that this is part of a long transformation of these countries as part of the global crisis of the post-war capitalist cycle, going on and increasing ever since the 70s, within a subordinate position. I mean, for these countries, within a subordinate position. However, since the question here is democracy, if we look from the perspective of democracy and democratic politics, then these socially detrimental aspects of the transition are also linked to the alliances that those groups who came to power in the new democratic institutions made. These were, in most of the cases, alliances with various capitalist groups, and in a very small amount of the cases, alliances with workers. This striking contradiction between democratization and the introduction of social polarization is at the basis of the question that we can ask in face of these revolutions as democratic. This contradiction used to be papered over in many narratives through the idea that these revolutions were civil society driven. But how can we uphold this very nice normative idea of civil society as everyone when a democratic revolution led by civil society was at the same time detrimental to the larger part of the society? This contradiction between democratization and the introduction of social polarization is very striking in the case of '89 and the symbolic value that it carries. But it is not specific to the post-socialist transitions. It only lies bare the gap between formal democracy and democracy rooted in social economic organization that is today laid bare everywhere. We know that the failure of this promise of democracy is today used by populists to legitimate new capitalist regimes that build new authoritarian ways of dealing with the crisis to the benefit of capital. But this is not the main lesson, probably. Probably the main lesson for democratization movements is that this gap needs to be filled. That filling the gap between democracy and social polarization is the real answer to both the crisis of democracy and the political crisis that we experience today as the rise of populist authoritarianism.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this view. Now we have quite some different perspectives. I wonder if you would like now to react to each other before I start opening this panel to the audience. If you have no immediate reaction, then I might just right now start the opening the debate to the audience. I think that we should have a microphone here, or people going with mics who will be helping you. So please take a mic and just introduce yourself shortly and go ahead. Okay, nobody is daring now. Okay, just think about it. I will have my own questions, and then I'll open my tip again. Now, I very much liked the way you picked up on the questions. I would have a maybe question to each of you, but I would not like to to take most of the time for the discussion. If people are not picking up their voices, then I will do. But I would like to pose a question to all of you. What we did not actually touch here very much was the difference of understanding of 1989 East-West. Agnes was pointing to it in terms of actually really talking much more about 1989 as a milestone in the development of capitalism rather than democracy, whereas the previous three speakers would still sort of stick much more to 1989 as a milestone of democracy. But what does it mean in terms of East and West in Europe? For a long time after the integration of some former communist countries into EU, we were thinking that this cleavage is closing. Now with the migration crisis, we see it's again there, and we also see that the memory of 1989 is very different. I was just now participating to a couple of German discussions about 1989, and there it's striking. The historical memory of these people is so different. You know, the West German was first celebrating the fall of the wall, and then he went to his work and everything was as it was before. The same happened with the reintegration, the unification of Germany in October 1990. The West German would celebrate, and then he goes to his work and everything follows as ever. The East Germans, everything changed from one day to another. Their lives changed. Their you know, the social order in which they were living changed. And I think this is some kind of symbolism of the whole Europe, how the Western Europe, West European and how East European, and those who actually have this experience of complete you know, failure of one social order in which these people were living. So what does it mean? Is this closure of different understanding of what 1989 means between East and West? Is it closing or is it opening more? And then, because we have historical conference, and somehow, I mean, what we had now was more like political and social reflection of 1989, but I would like to ask you, not all of you are historians, but if you would have the possibility to stand up in front of a historical commission who is deciding where to put the money, and they want to study 1989, what would be the one big historical question to 1989 or regarding 1989 that you would like to pose now? I mean, James was mentioning this kind of thing that actually this is also in my mind for a long time, like how much liberal there was already, maybe before 1989, how much liberal moment there was in it. We somehow seem not to have seen it in 1989. It was really democratic moment, democracy growing from below, but these revolutions are changing from democratic into clearly liberal revolutions in the course of 1 year. It was very, very fast. So something liberal must have been. But anyway, I don't want to push it into this direction. So what would be your one big, crucial, cardinal question for the historians? Now you make a research into that, and I would like to know the answer after 5 years. James, would you like to start?
So your first question was on different perceptions and your experience of West German ideas about 89, and I think that goes back to my initial point about the West didn't think it would be changed. It was simply the East catching up with us. And actually, until very recently, there's been actually remarkably little work on how much the West has been changed, but maybe there's a few things I can say. I think, firstly, the kind of acceleration of neoliberal Europe. And Philip Tehr's book on Europe after 1989 is quite insistent on this point, that actually, and in fact we write about it in our book as well, the way in which often neoliberal reformers in the 1990s, who were often there in the 1980s as well, kind of preparing and then come to the fore in certain countries, Czech Republic, Poland being two examples in the early 1990s, are often more radical than their Western counterparts. They have what they see as a blank slate to work from. And I was very surprised seeing IMF reports in the early 1990s of saying, hang on a minute, this you know, slow down. Don't do it this fast. But then this allows actually Western reformers to actually draw on the Eastern European experience, and the development particularly of low-wage sectors in certain Western European countries draws on the Eastern European experience. That's number one. Number two, you might think about revived nationalisms. And in particular, the ways in which certain minority nationalist movements from northern Italy to Belgium to Scotland to Catalonia actually draw on this experience of breakup in the early 1990s. That's maybe another area. And the third one I think I would suggest is simply the conception of Europe. Dagmar talked about looking at 1989 from the point of view of Africa. This is something we do in our book, and it's very striking that across Africa, 1989 is understood as something rather different. It's understood as the reconstitution of a kind of colonial global north or a colonial Europe that can only have a bad impact on Africa in the longer term. Boutros Ghali, the UN Secretary General in the early 1990s, refers to the movement of the Berlin Wall from a north-south divide of Europe to something moving across the Mediterranean. So that got us to think a lot about the role that Eastern Europe played actually in reconceptualizing an idea of Europe in the late 20th century, which is not actually just a kind of celebratory story of a continent coming together, but is also about all sorts of new forms of exclusions, borderings, the idea of fortress Europe. So that maybe is another area you can look at. Indeed, the very term fortress Europe, which was first used by Nazi propagandists towards the end of the Second World War in defense of a Nazi Europe, gets taken up again in the early 1990s by African politicians and economists. They are the ones who revive it in the post-Cold War, and then it gets taken up by critics of the EU and its bordering regime in the decades after, but it's Africans who bring this up first. So I would say acceleration of neoliberalism, revived nationalisms, and bordered Europe. And I won't answer your second question. Because you are historian. No, because I've said too much.
What was the second question?
What is the major historical question you would like to put to the historians of 1989 nowadays? What you think is worth researching?
I am actually, maybe I will pick up on that one rather than the first one. I'm actually more and more puzzled about what actually happened ideologically. For instance, between 1985 and 1990, because the more I try to remember our debates and positionings in the late 80s, and also reading some of the major texts of some dissidents, and some programmatic texts even, like the first text of the Civic Forum in Prague, you realize that it was not actually a neoliberal program of the which would celebrate the victory of the West over East. Those discourses of the late 80s were more like, we are looking for a future where this bipolarity will vanish, right? Where those ideological discourses will also vanish, because now we know that neither right nor left has the full truth, right? And then, I mean, the epitome of this, I mean, the entrance to this 80s, which I would call post-ideological 80s, was the piece by Leszek Kolatkovsky from, I think, 78, 79, How to be a liberal conservative socialist, or something like that, in which he made this statement. It was a playful piece, brilliant piece, where he made a statement that we somehow feel that all those old ideologies of the 90s are dead, right? And we can now begin the new kind of political discourse on the clean table, you know, and we can put the elements of truth from conservatism, from liberalism, from socialism, and tinker a sort of position which would be post-ideological, right? And there were other developments parallel to this. For instance, the stress on technocratic knowledge rather than ideological discourses. And Michal Kopeček, in one of his of the last books of his and other people, actually follow some of those discourses, which were more technocratic than ideologically neoliberal. But even I remember, you know, having Jiří Dinsby, one of the first signatories of Charter 77, in my flat in Brno in '88. People asking him what his position on the NATO and the Warsaw Pact. And he's saying, yeah, of course, if there is something like the radical transformation of our regime, of course, both the Warsaw Pact and the NATO will resolve themselves, right? And many other examples which I could add until '89, basically, including '89. For instance, the first program of the Civic Forum was basically mixed economy. Some privatization, but some other, you know, sort of balanced post-ideological. So how come then within 1 year or so, suddenly, all those people, including some of the individuals, suddenly Jiří Dinsby said, no. The NATO should stay in place, right? And we will join NATO. And of course, another example of the same sort of, or maybe the last one will be Jacek Kuroň. Many of those leftist intellectuals, Jiří Dinsby also told us in '88 a group of young people who asked him about his, ideological position that he was a democratic socialist. Okay? He never repeated that in 1990, when he entered the official position. Jacek Kuron was a leftist intellectual, an old socialist, reform communist, then dissident, who voted for Balcerovich's shock therapy, basically, as a politician. Then very quickly he regretted that. In 95, when he was trying to be elected as president, had actually disowned his decision. But my question would be, and maybe also to add the South African examples, I never really understood why the African National Congress completely dropped its economic program. Yeah. So that would be an interesting question. How? Because now, of course, retrospectively, many people think that in the 80s, there was already this neoliberal discourse. There was already the discourse that actually one side of the Cold War is right, the other side is wrong. But that was not what I was experiencing until the very late 89.
I can actually start with the last remark. Why did ANC drop its economic program? Because it's closely linked to what fascinates me and what I think I would like to actually study in the future. And that's, I already mentioned it, I will just repeat it. But it's this connection that we don't necessarily make at first instance. There is quite a bit of research on the story of human rights, moral globalization, etc. This story of the second half of 20th century, through the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, all of the covenants, etc., how they have inspired dissidents, including the African National Congress, in their opposition, etc., etc. How this program of human rights, individual and collective alike, how they were incorporated into the dissident movements, and essentially how they came to shape the program after 1989. I think that in a way helps us explain also why the African National Congress was willing to, during the negotiations and shortly after, to go that route and postpone things like land reform. Actually, it has not happened to this day in South Africa. It is promised in the constitution that it will be dealt with, but it has never been dealt with. They have put the kind of the language of universal individual human rights within the liberal tradition and British constitutionalism. I mean, most of the South African lawyers, even though they would proclaim a strong alliance towards communist ideology, they were trained in English tradition schools, and they revered especially British constitutionalism, parliamentarism, electoral laws, etc. That's actually quite copied from the British tradition of thinking and of legal expertise, etc., etc. So I actually think, and there's research on moral globalization, Ignatieff writes about it, and there's a book on Helsinki processes in Central and Eastern Europe, etc., etc. And usually they are not put next to the literature, or they don't converse with the literature on the economic reforms and essentially how they went in parallel and how they actually reinforced each other. Even though the human rights agenda, of course, had the noblest ideas, noblest goals, etc., inspiring for all kinds of different movements, ideologically extremely different. But everywhere, essentially, this language, including the European Union and the legacy of 1989, it was again the language of human rights, where the legacy of 1989 was essentially adopted, and later on EU took ownership of this narrative through the language of rights, through the language of freedoms, and essentially reinterpreted it for all of Europe. I mean, to actually quite a strong opposition from some of the groups from Central and Eastern Europe. So I think it's this combination of the moral globalization kind of trends and tendencies on ideational level, if you will, the liberalism in the sphere of ideas, and the economic program essentially that followed a bit later, which came to the scene a bit later and with full force only really after 1991 when USSR has exited from the scene and when the Cold War has actually exited from the scene, and the way the world has exited from the Cold War, that constellation, that combination both of the moral principles and the economic program essentially to this, and the conservative underpinning of that era essentially to this day shapes and describes the world order that we have now, including European fragmentation, including the apocalyptic populism that rose with global crises and migration crises and rogue states and all kinds of problems that come kind of from this coalition, because economic program alone is not usually sufficient to legitimize new realities. You need a moral program to go along with that for that justification. And I think that unfortunately this type of moral globalization that, for example, and I'm a human rights activist and I've studied human rights my entire life, but I believe it has helped this coalition. So I think that's what will fascinate me kind of next, in a way.
I'm not a historian, so from the side. What seems to me really interesting about '89 is to move away from '89 and look at the continuity of the transformation and do a political economic comparative history of how this integration into the global crisis happened as socialist economies and then as transitional economies. And within that, also to look at this ideational or expertise level, not only in terms of what were the ideas, where did they come from, did they have a, I don't know, Ford scholarship, but in terms of the substantive situations in which they were working in and what they were working with, what kind of money they could use for what was happening within, lower echelons of local industries, employment already from the 70s on. How the, social coalitions, expert coalitions, proto-capitalist fractions already were created through that. And I think this is being done, but having it in a globally comparative way, also with the very similar, but in another way not so similar, Latin American cases and so on, it really seems very interesting to me.
Thank you very much. We are running slowly out of time. I know that this big hall is not inviting people to stand up and ask questions, but I already see David. So please just now raise your hands. Okay, I have two. We'll have two. I think it's just enough. You have three there? Is it there? Anybody? No, we have two. So, mics, three, and that's enough.
Thank you. David Priestland from Oxford University. I'm afraid a rather present-oriented question relating to some of the comments that the panelists made earlier. I was particularly interested by this discussion about the nature of 1989 and the importance of the reaction against the state. I suppose 1989 is a bourgeois, if you like, a bourgeois revolution against the state rather than a Jacobin revolution that Pavel Balcha mentioned. And that struck me as being something that has a sort of global significance as well. I think many leftist intellectuals wanted to find a way forward that was avoided these states which they didn't trust anymore or they found overbearing many of the global left found that there was a crisis of the role of the state. They found them overbearing, over-violent, over-authoritarian. And I can see, I thought it was a very interesting point, the argument that somehow that perception has changed in many countries, that now and I think that's crucial to the development in politics, and I recognize it in the Britain and America as well, as clearly as you do in Czech Republic. However, that seemed to contradict or be different, really, to your, Dagmar Kusa's point about the anxiety about corrupt states and the problem that states, you know, so do we want more states? Do people want more states today, or are they worried about corrupt states which actually can't be trusted, and therefore we have to find alternative paths? And this is something that really I see in many countries of the global south when I talk to people, that actually the sort of Anglo-American conversation, and clearly a Czech conversation, about the problem of the need for states to protect us against these invisible forces of markets and climate change, people don't, in many countries, people clearly don't trust states. They don't think that, I mean, perhaps they feel they can capture them, but often they feel they can't capture them. They're captured by corrupt groups. So I suppose I'm just wondered if I could have a response to that sort of tension. I mean, do we find a divided world between different attitudes to the states? In a way, is 1989 perhaps relevant to some countries, but not others?
Okay, thank you. We collect the questions. So Adela Gyuričová was second.
Hello, it's Adela Gyuričová from the Institute of Contemporary History. We're very critical today of the early historiography of, you know, local communisms in Eastern Europe. At that time, in the 1990s, we were explaining, I mean, local historians were explaining the communist eras as something that should be sort of forgotten, you know, overcome, expelled from the history. So the new free history of the countries was bound to the pre-communist histories. Now we're very critical of that today. We say it was not an episode, you know, imposed from outside. It was a very integral process. The communisms were changing and all that. But aren't you doing something similar? You're speaking about communism as a little episode in the history of capitalism, of global capitalism here, aren't you? Shouldn't you, I mean, shouldn't we all historicize also the 90s and the following decades? Come on, there were so many institutions that survived and were not just joining, you know, the West. They were adapting, yes, but so were many Western institutions. And many Western institutions are falling apart these days, aren't they?
Thank you. The last one, Mr. Jonáš. Here, here in front. Tady vepředu.
Ondřej Jonáš, Praha. I'm not a historian, so forgive my naivete. It seems to me that 30 years ago, certain rules were put in place, rules of the game, which have led to results, say, in the media industry, of very highly concentrated media, and compared to what I experienced 30 years ago, very limited discussion or much lower sophistication, I would say, of the options, of the decisions taken, and of the consequences. The other point I'd like to make is that starting in 2004, maybe 2008, political parties across Europe, and especially Social Democrats, have lost a substantial portion of their votes, going from roughly 30 to 40% to today somewhere around 20 and less. And so there seems to be a crisis on the left, which seems to relate to simply not knowing how to move forward. So I wonder if that's something you could comment on. And the situation that Europe finds itself in, and here I'd like to address some of the comments with respect to the concentration of capital. It seems to me that capital is cheap. In fact, with negative interest rates, it's better than free. But the concentration of power behind capital, and certainly the oligarchs and oligarchization which we see across Eastern Europe, and here I refer to the rules that were put in place 30 years ago, seems to lead to results where you have oligarchs that clearly have their roots in the old regime. You know, our prime minister was an agent of STB, and I don't know the situation in other East European countries, but it seems to me that the crisis of media and of the discussion and its inability to perhaps counter or reflect this, and they're supposed to be the watchdogs of democracy. You know, what has happened? Thank you.
Thank you very much. We obviously, now, not that you address all of the questions, because there were many of them and very interesting ones, very good points. So everybody is getting like 2 minutes. Who would like to start? Maybe we could start now with the ladies first. Would you, Dagmar?
Sure. I think all three questions are actually closely related. Corruption, forgetting communism, and essentially the establishment of the oligarchs in the present system. All three of them are, in my opinion, very closely related. I will be the first one to agree that we have outdone ourselves in forgetting communism and fascism, at least in Slovakia. There is extremely little, both discourse and, I mean, academic work a bit more so, but not in the mainstream. It's not something that feeds everyday discussions or that would be discussed on the media, etc., etc. We even, and this is not my invention, I think it was Zoltán Duisin who came up with the term of the exporting of the guilt, that essentially by criminalizing the past, I mean, on the one hand, you give it the symbolic label, but on the other hand, if you label entire chunks of past as criminal, you are not any longer able to distinguish between individual responsibility. It's much easier not to deal with the responsibility for collaboration or distinctions between different social roles people have played. Although I think research is actually coming back to daily life, ordinary life, and how these networks of collaboration have sustained. So in some areas it is actually being dealt with. But in Slovakia, and that's Czech research, by the way, in Slovakia, in large, we really are not dealing neither with communism nor with fascism, which is important. You will still find, I mean, it has repercussions in academic scene. You will find hints of censorship even. I mean, if you want to publish on related topics, you might find that you'll be accused of having a political agenda, or you have to publish abroad. Most of this type of research is actually in Slovakia published abroad, or what gets published is chronological kind of description of events, or around 1989, I mean, talking about this type of memory, it's very superficial, nostalgic, you know, memoirs with photographs, etc. We're completely lacking like a robust piece of academic work on this past. It has consequences because, as you said, I mean, the design, institutional design that was established in 1989 counted or established this impunity, essentially, into the system. It is linked to current corruption. It is linked to the extremely favorable position of oligarchs in Slovakia. We see it now. We're reaping the benefits of this design, essentially, today, because it was this atmosphere and impunity made it very easy to push the boundaries and see how much, who can I buy and who can I, you know, hide in my pocket. And our oligarchs, we are finding out, were extremely successful on this ground. Every day we discover new judges, prosecutors who were bought, essentially, and who were able to change court decisions in favor of oligarchs, and for decades. So it has significant consequences, and I think it's all essentially linked to how we deal with the past and how we're able to deal with it institutionally in a systematic way, how to translate it into justice. We see constant decline of trust in institutions, not only in Central and Eastern Europe, but in this region it's alarmingly low. In Slovakia, more than 80% of people believe that the justice system is entirely corrupt. And that's, how do you say it in English? For democracy, that's extremely bad news. I mean, rule of law is the basic foundation upon which a democratic society can survive. It is there to protect in times of crises, etc. But what do you do if nobody believes it, if you see every day evidence that it has been sold and it doesn't operate for the citizen, you know. So that's a serious problem, and I think it goes back to that design. I'm sorry.
Thank you.
About this larger question of the left not knowing how to move forward and how it's related to Pavel's narrative about the state, politics through the state. In world systems tradition of research, there is this narrative about the history of modern anti-systemic movements, meaning against the effects of global capitalism as a system. And there they say that basically you have the social version that reacts to the contradiction between work and capital, and there is the version that reacts to the global polarization, that is the national liberation movement. And within the first, the social version, you have the rupture between social democratic and Bolshevik revolutions. And they say that throughout the 20th century, all of these managed to grab state power. But while being in state power, all of them ended up in the managing seat of a capitalist economy, or integrating into a world capitalist economy. And they managed the boom period of the post-45 era, but all of them started to feel the contradictions that were produced by this, and in all of them, the counter movements were produced. And by '68, you have a delegitimation of all the three versions. And this brings not only liberal counter currents in the West, or experts, dissidents and workers going against socialism in communist countries, or fundamentalist revolutions in the global South. But it also means that this basic question of grabbing power through the state and then politically doing the anti-systemic project was questioned, and this is the '68 idea that then goes on. And then what about the crisis of the left today? Actually, from my perspective, there is a convergence now, which is also aided because of the climate crisis looming, where the idea is that the present economic social order, where anything only happens if it's profitable, cannot solve the climate crisis. And because of this, there is a need to have economy in social hands so that we can organize our material survival in ways that serve only survival and not profit. And I see that, this is something that is widely shared on left echelons of either Latin America, the US, or Europe, or South Africa as well. The question is, what is the power position from which you have these ideas?
Thank you. Who would like to go? James?
Okay, so I'll just attempt to answer a few. Okay, so maybe to bring together some points that Agnes and Adela made. Yes, in terms of, I think it would be very helpful to try to overcome this way in which the communist period is understood very much in popular culture, which is both informed by the kind of revival in totalitarianism as a category in the 80s, which then informed this notion of 1989 as the absolute break, and the period before that is criminality, and it's something almost outside history. And also this post-colonial approach to the past. No, we were occupied, it's not part of our national history. Rather, I think some of the points that Agnes made in particular about thinking about the region in terms of the broader shift in global capitalism and thinking about the long 89 from, let's say, the early 1970s and the kind of collapse of Bretton Woods right up until the financial crisis in 2008 would be a much, I think, a much more informative way of seeing the way in which the region has shifted. So, as you talked about this notion of semi-peripherality and this notion of how you escape being peripheral, has always been a central question for Eastern European economists, elites. The early communist period, people saw autarky shifting away from the West as something really important. By the 1970s, the notion increasingly that you can start to integrate, there can be proto-capitalist forms, as you said, becomes part of the debate. And therefore, we also have to see this production of the change from within, from technocratic groups, from economists and so on, which Michał and others are studying. But this is a shift that happens in the 70s. And we have to think about why the kind of danger of being re-peripheralized through the integration into the Western capitalist system in the late Cold War is no longer seen as so much of a threat. I think this is a really central, interesting question we can ask, and why. Okay, so that's one point. The other point I want to emphasize is that in reaction to the kind of economics, moral crises of late socialist societies, there are alternatives being presented, and we haven't really discussed those. I mean, to put it very simply, could Eastern Europe have gone the Chinese way towards some sort of authoritarian capitalism? And it's certainly the case that there were many advocates for that in the 1980s. In 1980, just as one example, in 1982, the IMF, in fact, recommend that Poland under martial law is a fantastic place to invest. You know, this is a strong state that has the ability to reform markets, to bring capitalist reform to the region, and that's much better than solidarity. Solidarity for them, wishy-washy oppositionists who want lofty ideas of workers' councils and workers' reform. What you want is authoritarian capitalism, and Jaruzelski will provide it. So there are many other routes into dealing with the crisis of being of the economic crisis and escaping peripherality in late socialism. And that final point, that also means that people look elsewhere than the West. And you were talking about this kind of looking to the West. One thing we haven't talked about is the way in which, in the late Cold War, and even after, people have looked to other world regions which they've seen as similar peripheries or semi-peripheries. So Latin America and East Asia have often also functioned as interesting models. And actually, we've seen that come back. So that which we had in the 1980s, looking to the East Asian tigers, or beginning to look at China, though not quite because it hadn't taken off, is now coming back under populists such as Orban, who look to Singapore or the East Asian tigers as models for Eastern European economies. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you very much. Pavel said that he's not going to speak because we are really over time. I would like to thank the panelists very much. If, you know, they say that democracy is the only political regime that cannot survive without criticism, so I think that we provided some life water today, hopefully for democracy and for reflection of 1989. Thank you very much all for being here, and now I will say that I should also say there is some kind of little reception here next door, hopefully, so let's join us together and continue the discussion. Thank you.